Thank you so much. Thank you, Uta, for the very generous introduction. First, I would like to yes, thanks to the organizer for having me here. I want to acknowledge my gratitude to Dr. Ingrid Nguyen, um, who whose scholarship on the history of art in Cambodia from the late colonial period to post-independence inspired many fellow scholars, including myself. Also, I want to acknowledge that some of materials from the U.S. National Archive is kindly shared with me by Dr. Roger Nelson. Um, Thank you, Panya, for providing a good, context and a background. So that allows me to better dive into. Actually, I want to talk about three particular projects, and I want to have a closer look at them, and focusing on exhibiting, and how to look. And because my interest is not just about architecture, but how it used and how that does produce and what's happening around them. So after uh, gaining independence from France in 1953, there was no time to wait for Cambodia to celebrate its new chapter, one from a colony to a self-ruled state. So it's time to place Cambodia in the map of the global community. So you see here is pamphlet cover and posters of the international exhibition in Phnom Penh in 1955, which was realized immediately after Sihanouk became the head of state at that year. So you could see that there is an immediate urgency in exhibiting and projecting what is an independent state and what does that mean for Cambodia to the international community as well as to its local audience. So yes, so this first so-called international exhibition, because if you want to be international, you either how to create a site or a place where the global, is sit together. So this is one of a very classic example. So in this exhibition, so the invited pavilions include, France, Holland, India, Japan, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, United States, and Great Britain, which included in that Malaysia and Singapore. But what interesting was, I'm particularly interested in the Cambodian pavilions. So for Cambodia alone, there were 4 pavilions, and dedicated for one is natural resources, technical resources, social resources, and cultural resources. So what does that mean, to exhibit natural, technical, social, and cultural through basically architectural space. And I'm particularly interested in the architecture. So because it's one of the very early example after independence where architects was trying to look for new expression, an expression that represents modernity, that represents a new a state of self-sufficient and is part of the international community. So this one among the 4 pavilions, and the main materials that were used was glass and it was listed in the cover material that is mainly the 2 material mentioned was glass and plastic. So as you could see that, there's like extending vertical columns, angular geometry, and this is to resonate with the forms that associated with the so-called international modernism, right? But one interesting, so the architect who built the pavilions was Saint Sentang. He was trained in France, but he was not trained in architecture. He was trained in decorative art. So the Cambodian pavilions receive a lot of praise from the local audience that it is very modern and it's very pleasing. So yes, Cambodia, it's time to present as a newly independent modern state to be seen as a legitimate member of international community. The exposition was to show to the visitors that the country was secure, infrastructure in place, and the process of independence is represented by modernity, creativity, and resourcefulness. So there is, over the course of the 26 days exhibition, there's a full list of exciting program and events, including Asian film competitions, Miss Cambodia pageant, a contest, international photo competition, sports competition, dance and music performances, even auction to raise funding to support a women association. And of course, interestingly, including a zoo of exotic animals from Cambodia. So what interesting here is what we see, there is sort of an interesting departure, contrasting departure from how architecture was used to exhibit, no, from the colonial exposition, and this was more like a copy and paste of the Angkorian architecture to become a securing anchor to present what was from Cambodia. And also, it was an interesting departure from this design by Jacques Grolier. It's today's National Museum. Back then, it's called Musée Albert Sarraut. In the 1920s. And Grolier, as Panya mentioned, was the director of the Fine Art University. So he came up with this modern expression that includes the Cambodian character, as you could see these roofing references to the Cambodian temple. And it's one of the remarkable architecture, and we call modern architecture in Cambodia. But again, I want to highlight that this stark contrast, of departure and trying to form a new language of what was sort of like modern architecture for Cambodia. Also, interestingly, what we see, there is a continuation or a residue that is used in the form of exhibition from the colonial method, still sort of like showing natural resources, what Cambodia has, but at the same time, this time Cambodia presents what it can do by itself, what it could do by itself. So the technological advancement, the industrial, as well as art and creativity. Just want to show one interesting photograph. So this was, yes, Norodom Sihanouk, head of state, together with his parents, the king and the queen mother, visiting the television at the US pavilion. Among many pavilion, the US pavilion attracted a lot of attention because of TVs. And it was described quite interestingly, and to us maybe it sounds bizarre, but at that time it was among like new technology to be seen by many Cambodian, and they were described, oh, this kind of like new machine that has picture and voice, so So learning from that, also there was no time to wait for the U.S. to also exercise their cultural projects. As you know that after independence, it is also the Cold War. Maybe it's hot as well, like our colleagues mentioned earlier. So the Soviet bloc as well as the U.S. were competing in offering aid and also implementing cultural diplomacy. One of the largest cultural projects that the U.S. Implemented was called American Festival. And this was a project that started 1 year after the International Expo, so it's in 1956 to 1953. And it's a traveling project that goes through in different parts of Cambodia. So the two key components in this festival, because it's a series of exhibition and performances demonstrating art and culture from the US. But mainly there are also two photography exhibitions, one of which is called Life in America. So it is, as you could see on this billboard of the information, so it is to provide Cambodians an imaginary trip to a great friendly nation in the West. And through this exhibition, the US want to give a representation of a modern daily life in so-called free world. What would our life be in the free world to the Cambodian audience? So includes sort of like, activities at home, life at home with microwave, right? With this sort of like modern furniture, people at work or on the farm, or even as well as what a modern city is like in the US. No? So yes, so it's through this pictorial story of the American way of life. I want to show a bit more. So you can see these like students, they come to visit this exhibition, and the photographs. I'm not sure about the reception of the photographic exhibition, but for the reception of the performance in particular was not so positive, because the report after the event was reporting like, oh, this talk of music was like a turkey gobbling, or the audience would just keep chattering the whole time through the performances. And so from the performance side was not so well received, but the photographic side, I'm not sure. There's not much was mentioned. Also, they through this photographic and traveling exhibition, the American also run photo competitions. So they would give out cameras to the Cambodian amateurs, so then they can so-called assimilate, the images that the American photographer produced. However, the Cambodian-U.S. relation deteriorated from the late 50s. Then the U.S. aid to Cambodia all terminated by the 1963, and eventually the diplomatic ties were cut off in 1965. However, all these lessons, never went to waste. Sihanouk set up an ambitious project. This was Basak Riverfront, which was a public cultural district. And it was, to me, it's a translation of basically a state's ideology in the physical space. No? It was actually, it's situated actually on the side of the river. Initially, it was a river swamp. So basically, it's the swampy land, and therefore it became like magic and reclaimed, transformed it into the so-called a projection of what a modern future society of Cambodia is, that grounded on public and culture. So the facility in the districts include public housings. As you see, like there's a big space garden in the middle that you could not see now, but the National Theatre, exhibition halls, among other projects that did not realize by then, including a gallery. So the white building that Panya mentioned was the one that's situated basically it's white on the picture. And as you could see, the stark contrast to the landscape of the city at that time. And the situation, the location of the district itself, it's by no coincidence, because to me, it's also strategic if you look at where it is. So it's at the intersection of main two axes. To the north is the Royal Palace, and to the east, no, west. To the west is the Independence Monument. So that means if you look out from Independence Monument to the east, the sun will rise over Basat Riverfront, a hope and prosperous new future. What interesting, what we see, uh, some of the key facilities here. One on the top is an exhibition hall, and that's the white building. That's the gray building. Both are two housing. Um, and this is the National Theatre, or Prasaramarit Theatre, which was one of the finest example of modern Khmer architecture or new Khmer architecture, chiefly realized and became its peak of maturity. To me, it's amazing. So this the exhibition hall. So what did it exhibit? So learning from history again, nothing went to waste. So picking up from the previous exposition and also a project realized by the American Cultural Diplomacy, now it's time for Sihanouk to also present the Cambodian achievement. So in the exhibition halls, basically it's an achievement of the state, what the state has achieved through building infrastructure, industry, production of export goods, as well as arts and crafts. And as you could see here, the exhibition hall became one of the most important must visit a station for all the foreign delegates. All foreign delegates must go through a tour of the city, and that is a must stop. So they would go through to see what Cambodia achieved and how under the support of the state and Sihanouk per se. But also what interesting at the same time, we see also some materials, crafts and art from other countries as well. So we see a microcosm of the world inside of this exhibition hall through, of course, the lens of the states. For me, what I find here is like how that exhibition and the structure of the exhibition is utilized to assert certain ideologies, and how whether there is a consistent narrative or whether there's some cracks and holes. Of course, the Sihanouk's project of Basak riverfront was starting to shake even before the civil unrest and his ousting in the 1970s. For example, in the White Building, it was one of the earliest example to provide social housing in the so-called modern multi-story apartments. But in terms of the functionality, it was not at its best. From my conversation with the architect Louis Van Hap in 2015, when I asked him, what do you think about this project? Do you like this among other projects? He said, well, it's an experimental. So he acknowledged that. So what interesting, it become very interesting architecture where people continue to make shift, adapt to meet their needs. And apparently the lighting and ventilation was not sufficiently designed. And the so-called pro-public, pro-culture ideology of Sihanouk starting to crack by around the late 60s because the stark contrast with the projected modernity in the city and what is the real life of the people in the countryside. And so therefore, the ousting by the General Lunol in the 1970s. Interestingly, I want to conclude by going back to Basak riverfront. Today, many of these facilities were scraped off, demolished, or turned into private facilities, unrecognizable. Actually, only these angular apartments that's still intact and used as a Russian embassy. What happened across the Basat riverfront is a new complex, also continue the idea of reclaiming. It was starting a very small land and then reclaim becoming an expansive land, and it's called Diamond Island. So you see across the river, small bridge from Basak riverfront area is now a new era of modernity, of a very confusing mix of architectural references from China, from Vietnam. We see Roman architecture next to Chinese garden. To many, some conscious people, they would say maybe it's like Vegas, but it is so popular. Many people love it, young, old, across a generation. They come to the Diamond Island, the entertainment and how it catered to a very broad range of classes, from cheap eatery to high posh apartment housing. So the notion of modernity has become something else, and I'm not sure if it is productive. Thank you.